Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Shazrik Umberhill. I'm the Director for Strategy and Impact at Resilience First. And on behalf of my colleagues at Resilience First, Resilience Rising, and the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, it's my pleasure to welcome you to our event, marking a key milestone of our joint initiative, the Corporate Climate Resilience Pathways Initiative. Today, we're celebrating the launch of our first report and the principles for corporate climate resilience leadership, which are a working set of principles. We'll be going into them later today. Thank you very much for joining us. Before we begin proceedings for the day, some very quick points of housekeeping. First, a reminder to check your unmute, please. This will really help ensure it's an optimum experience for everyone on the line. If you have any questions or comments during this session, please feel free to drop these into the question box at any point during the event. We've got time set aside towards the end of the session to address comments from the audience, and we'd very much love to hear your thoughts. This is also the point where I'd usually point guests to the nearest facilities and fire exits, but we're online today, so I'm hoping you're already familiar with these, wherever you're joining us from. A quick run through of the agenda now, and I'm hoping my colleague can bring those up on screen for us. So the agenda for today, we will begin with some opening remarks and scene setting from our principals, Nat and Seth. You'll hear about our initiative and the report and principles we're launching today. Next, a keynote from our guest speaker, Raquel Moses, representing the UN Climate Champions team. We'll then head into a panel discussion with our expert lineup of speakers led by C2ES's Verena Radulovic. They'll be exploring the drivers of and barriers to corporate climate resilience and what leading companies are doing to accelerate action in this space. We'll round out the discussion with some Q&As and share some next steps for our plans for the rest of the year. So now, without further ado, I'll turn to Nat Cohen, President at C2ES, and Seth Schultz, CEO of Resilience Rising and Managing Director at Resilience First, to introduce our initiative and talk about the exciting work we are launching today. Nat, the floor is yours.
Well, thanks so much, Shazray, and hello, everyone. We're so glad you could join us today. I'm Nat Cohen, President of C2ES. For those new to C2ES, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan climate policy think tank. Our mission is to secure a safe and stable climate by accelerating the global transition to net zero greenhouse gas emissions and a thriving, just, and resilient economy. A foundation for our work is our Business Environmental Leadership Council, a group of mostly Fortune 500 companies leading on climate action. We provide them with a forum for peer exchange and engage them in our research and convenings with policymakers and other stakeholders on climate solutions. It's a pleasure to be with you today, and we're excited for the chance to share our work and continue this important conversation with you. So C2S, as I mentioned, has worked with companies for many years to understand and support corporate efforts around climate, including efforts to assess and address climate risks and help companies engage with their communities about those risks. In 2022, we released an emerging blueprint that outlines leadership roles that companies can play and strategies they can adopt to advance resilience in local communities. This work, and that of our partners at Resilience First and Resilience Rising, is part of a growing set of efforts across companies, NGOs, and multi-stakeholder collaborations to help companies address their physical climate risks. We're grateful to have many of you in our audience today. We're especially excited for this effort that we're calling the Corporate Climate Resilience Pathways Initiative. Seth will share more in just a moment, but I want to take a minute to frame today's discussion. Each year, the impacts of climate-related natural disasters on communities, infrastructure, and ecosystems cost tens of billions of dollars and affect the ability of businesses to operate. Planning for climate impacts is critical for businesses as the compounding effects of climate change will continue to reshape the global business landscape, even with significant cuts in greenhouse gas emissions. Our reality today demands immediate and strategic action from the private sector. The role of businesses in driving transformation in our global economy and helping to ensure the well-being of communities has never been more critical. We need a fundamental shift in how companies approach climate resilience and adaptation. We know that businesses need to invest in new technologies and adapt business models to address climate risks, which many of you are already thinking about. We think the time is right for the private sector to go much farther in scaling up its investment in climate resilience as a complement to the work being done to invest in decarbonization. Now, this is a quickly changing space with new disclosure regulations and new efforts to encourage resilience investment emerging at a steady pace. With this in mind, we're excited to offer a vision and plan to develop a common global framework and community of practice so that companies can take action with confidence. Our vision is one of transformation. We envision a world where businesses do not just adapt and survive, but lead the charge toward a sustainable and resilient future. The framework we are setting out to coalesce and build will clarify how companies across sectors can mainstream resilience into their operations and strategies, their value chains, and the communities they work in and operate in. It will build upon existing work and address gaps to guide communities towards priorities, practices, and investments in climate resilience that ensure long-term prosperity and environmental stewardship. And as we help to foster a community of practice across the private sector, companies will be better positioned to advocate for policies that strengthen business resilience while also accelerating decarbonization. As you'll see today, we are starting by setting a strong organizing foundation with working principles for corporate leadership on resilience. Then, by providing a cohesive framework and a dynamic platform for peer exchange, we aim to redefine the role of businesses to become proactive agents of change and pioneers of innovation, enabling them to respond to the current climate reality and to anticipate and shape the future, one in which they help protect communities and the global economy from climate vulnerabilities. Since our partnership began last year, we have engaged 70 stakeholders from a number of industries and organizations in expert dialogues to develop the business case, highlight key barriers and drivers for action, and identify the strategic direction needed to catalyze investment and impact. The headline report and principles capture our findings and will now guide our next activities aimed at translating the leadership principles into actionable practices that catalyze investment and impact, emphasizing science, transparency, accountability, inclusivity, and innovation for building resilience. We're now aiming to build on this momentum to develop a global resilience framework for businesses and engage companies and stakeholder organizations to endorse and support the principles and to share stories about corporate innovation. We began this effort with a belief that a collaborative, stakeholder-informed approach is necessary to identify and harmonize best practices to accelerate the pace of change. We will continue to engage businesses and key stakeholders to help develop, validate, and integrate their expertise each step of the way, and we invite those of you not yet engaged to join us. So that's a little bit of high-level framing. And I'm now excited to hand the spotlight over to Seth Schultz, CEO of Resilience Rising, to share more about what we've learned and the principles we're announcing today.
Thanks, Nat, and apologies, everyone, just a slight technical issue there. While Seth gets back on the line, I will introduce our next speaker, actually. So a key focus of our work through this initiative is building a cross-sectoral community of practice. So a safe collaborative space where individuals and organizations from across the public, private, and third sectors can come together, share ideas, learnings, and best practices. This is key. And we feel like this type of platform is really the key to driving innovation and ensuring that we are aligned with global efforts and goals on adaptation, facilitating the investments that we need in resilience building, and really advocating for truly transformative change at a systematic level. And so we're really delighted to be supported in this effort by the UN Climate Champions and have the endorsement of the Race to Resilience campaign for the principles and the work that we are launching today. Representing the climate champions here with us, it is my pleasure to welcome to the floor Raquel Moses, CEO of the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator and UN Global Ambassador. Raquel, thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome. Over to you.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor for me to be here with you. I want you to think about the modern advancements that we've had and how they've developed. We've been using renewable technologies for over a century, reaching a tipping point last year with 83% of new capacity being renewable globally. During the COVID pandemic, the healthcare advancements to roll out vaccines was enabled by the government, but with vaccines that were designed by the private sector. And now with AI, the Internet Foundation may have been established by the public sector, but all of the major solutions that we're seeing in technology are being created by the private sector through their vision and innovation. Climate change is an opportunity. According to Forbes, climate transformation is a 100 trillion investment opportunity. The winners of this race will be us all working together to deliver a cleaner, more resilient and hopeful future. Not just a future for future generations, but a future for us now. The private sector players that recognize this opportunity to not only build their internal resilience, but also to deliver services that build the resilience of others will be the global leaders of the future. Is it all good news? No. But if you do not see and seize the opportunity, by the time you make it to the buffet, all of the food will be gone. It is imperative that we act now. Climate impacts are widespread in every region of the world, with 3.5 billion people exposed to major climate hazards, such as heat, drought, and flooding. According to Lloyd's 2023 systematic risk scenario, global economic losses caused by extreme weather events over a period of 5 years could range between US $3 and $17.6 trillion. While only 32% of all private finance mobilized by official development interventions between 2018 and 2020 targeted climate-related issues, only 4% was for adaptation, and 7% when you combine adaptation and mitigation together as a single unit. So the vast majority to mitigation alone. In simple words, adaptation action needs to be urgently escalated. Failure to adapt puts the world at risk, the economies at risk, and companies out of business. So we have two options, two possible roads to traverse. One where we thrive and benefit from the inevitable action that needs to take place, or one in which we perish because we fail to take action. Resilience First, our Race to Resilience partner, alongside other key stakeholders, developed a set of guiding principles to encourage robust private sector action, setting in motion a clear pathway for businesses to rally action for resilience building. Building upon the efforts of the Race to Resilience campaign and the Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda to mobilize non-party stakeholders towards clear 2030 global adaptation targets and galvanize leadership and investment. And there are so many resources. Sharm el-Sheikh adaptation agenda, which presents a comprehensive global action plan focusing on transformation across various impact systems and enablers, with the goal of increasing resilience by 2030, as I mentioned. It's helping to bridge the gap between business action and advancing adaptation and resilience. The SSA latest publication, Businesses Catalyzing the Diversification of the Economies and Transition Towards New Markets, which are better aligned with the climate, nature, and people, includes businesses providing climate solutions through innovation, technology, and finance mechanisms, and businesses creating green jobs and supporting the just transition of the workforce. Thus, in this scenario, there are really no excuses. There are no reasons not to. There's just the time to take action, which is now. Act now, act swiftly, act strategically, but get started or ratchet up what you're already doing, because we need you to, and we need you to now. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Raquel. Thank you. Now, as you've heard from our opening speakers, businesses can and will be pivotal in our journey to securing a more climate resilient future for all. We know leading companies are already driving the innovations and investments needed to not just fortify their own operations and supply chains, but also support the communities with and within which they operate, to both prepare for and adapt to the impacts of climate change. However, as our research and consultations with nearly 70 sustainability and climate experts over the last few months confirm, the journey really is full of challenges and barriers that hinder progress and impact at the scale and speed needed. So our expert panel of speakers today will be discussing just some of these challenges, what they are doing in their organizations to overcome them, and the direction and leadership we need to bring our vision to reality. Moderating the discussion is Verena Radulovic, Vice President for Business Engagement at C2ES. Verena, welcome.
Hi there, Shazray. Thanks so much for having me. And I believe that Seth will join us, so I'll leave some time at the end for Seth to join us if he's available. So what we're going to do is I'm going to introduce our next 4 panelists, and we're going to have a discussion with them, all representing the private sector, on ways that they think that businesses can improve and strengthen resilience in their operations, in their value chains, and in the communities in which they operate. So first, I'll introduce you who's here. We are joined by Nick Fowle. Nick is the head of climate and sustainability risk at Marsh. In this role, he helps develop Marsh's global sustainability and climate services, including their risk modeling and management, and he supports clients as they transition to a net zero emissions future and adapt to climate change. We're lucky to also have Jess Vellante. She is the director for global environmental sustainability at AT&T. She's got a lot of experience working as an ESG professional, and she oversees AT&T's climate resilience strategy and helping to build corporate and community resilience. We'll hear from Peter Hall. He's the Managing Director for Climate Impact Advisory at Resonance, which is the private sector business for the firm implementing adaptation solutions that create resiliency. He leads on the integration of climate action, sustainability, and resilience, and looks at climate risks and community benefits as well. And last but certainly not least, we have Emily Wasley. She is the head of climate resilience and biodiversity at Meta, which is a unique role that we would love to see more and more companies have that title. And she leads the technical and strategic actions to embed climate risk management, resilience, and biodiversity company-wide. She's also one of the authors of the 5th National Climate Assessment, so watch out. Before we start, just as Nat may have mentioned earlier, we have a Business Environmental Leadership Council, and I oversee that here at C2ES, as well as our work on climate risk, carbon transition planning, and resilience. And we are really, really lucky to partner with Resilience Rising and Resilience First, my colleagues, Karen Yilmaz and Shazray Comber-Hill, as well as Amy Bailey, who couldn't join us today from C2ES, and really working with a wide group of stakeholders to develop a body of work and in partnership with many other organizations. So with that, the four leaders that we have here with us have been really integral in helping to shape and think about the future of resilience and business's role. So we'll get into it. We're going to talk about how we define a new vision for private sector leadership on climate resilience. We're going to look at some of the barriers and drivers of action and what companies are doing to tackle these. So first up, I'd like to bring Emily and Peter to the fore. All right. Emily, we're going to start with you. How do you understand climate resilience in the context of the private sectors and in your industry in particular, which is the tech industry?
Great. So thank you, Verena, for having me. And I think we've talked about this quite a bit in terms of, resilience has become quite a buzzword lately. So it's really important how we define it and how we understand it. So the report that was released today leverages several recent publications like the latest 5th National Climate Assessment, as well as the IPCC report and others. And really defines it as the ability of interconnected social, economic, and ecological systems to prepare for threats and hazards, adapt to changing conditions, and withstand and recover rapidly from adverse conditions and disruptions. So if you look at the report, it also mentions the fact that it includes, climate resilience as an umbrella, includes both the transition to low carbon or net zero, as well as the physical impacts of climate change. So understanding the definition is pretty key. Second, it's really important that we understand what elements are kind of included in that umbrella of climate resilience. So the way that we look at it at Meta, as a global business, we really think about everything from operations and the critical infrastructure upon which we depend to our value chain and neighboring communities. So it's really important that we take a systematic approach to climate resilience and think about the various elements that are included. So we think about it in terms of preparedness, response, recovery, adaptation, and transformation. So there are pieces that we need to take and actions we need to take that cover all of that. And so actually there's some different strategies that your organization has identified in a publication in 2022 called Emerging Blueprint from Companies to Advance Local Climate Resilience. So we've been looking at that in terms of different overarching strategies for climate resilience. And lastly, it's really important to start with some core principles. And that's what this report really lays out, is understanding why we're doing this work, what's important to us. And a couple that we really align well with are including science-based and proactive, transparent and accountable, safeguarding against maladaptation and enhancing adaptive capacity, inclusive and equitable and transformative. So understanding how it's defined, understanding what it includes, and then what the core principles are we can align with is really kind of how I'm understanding it for our industry and our corporate space.
Thank you, Emily. Peter, what do you think of that? How are companies that you're working with integrating climate resilience into their practices and decision making, and Resonance's role in that?
Yeah, thanks, Verena and Emily. Yeah, so at Resonance, we're a small impact advisory firm, advising clients on how climate can impact their business. And Rachel actually talked about this a little bit. Is we're seeing companies really start to shift from looking at climate impacts not just from a risk avoidance, like reducing their risks, but looking at how it creates a business value for them and how it can help them source from markets that are impacted by climate, and actually even starting to look at how it could be a business advantage. We're starting to see a shift with some of our clients, looking at how they even can provide services that help others in their value chain become more resilient, and of course how their own value chain can be more resilient. So what we're seeing companies and how we work with them is first understanding their risks, understanding like where they operate, what their value chains are, where they want to grow, what the climate impacts are along that value chain, and then what do they have to protect. And a key part, we're seeing companies really start to shift a little bit, hopefully more, into how they protect people. So people that work for them, people that are on their value chain, this people-centered focus approach. It's part of the SHARM adaptation agenda too. And some of the companies we're working for are now starting to see it as a sort of a transformational piece. They can access more funding and financing. They can ensure business continuity. They can penetrate new markets, and in a way that, in 5 or 10 years, especially looking at extreme heat in some of the sectors we work at, there'll be some winners and probably some losers for companies. And to give you a couple examples, we've also focused on some areas such as the CPG sector, the food and ag sector, the water sector, the financial sector, and increasingly we're seeing companies like Unilever, PepsiCo, Microsoft. We do some work with World Wildlife Fund, really driving the work. So the report that came out, the idea of having science-based, proactive, measurements, transparency, the safeguarding, enhancing the work, but then inclusive and equitable outputs in transforming. We're seeing a lot of our companies start to now see that and work with us. A big part of our work is partnerships. So helping companies better communicate within their own organizations, and then better communicate within their space and non-adjacent partners to do the work. So and the last thing, just highlighting this work, I think this year we're going to hear a lot more about this task force for inequality-related financial disclosures. So as this TIFD comes out, I was just talking to Inclusive Capitalism yesterday, I think that's really going to drive the work even more. So
interesting, yeah. One thing I'm going to come back to all the speakers at the end. I'm going to ask questions related to how thinking about resilience is both very similar to, and maybe a bit unique from, the way that companies think about their decarbonization and mitigation efforts, because I see a lot of parallels, Peter and Emily, in what you're mentioning. And I think for those that are listening, the goal here is, how do we create a more comprehensive view of climate, and how companies are both driving emissions down, but also building resilience. And Peter, I think the inequality issue is something we can potentially get into. I just want to remind people that for those listening, please add your questions to the chat. We'll have some time at the end to be able to address them. But with that, I'm going to turn now to Nick and to Jess, and we'll start with Nick. I'm curious for Marsh, what is driving Marsh to take action and on climate resilience and adaptation? And are these drivers changing if they're there?
Yes, thank you, Verena. So as Marsh, we work with our clients to help them understand the risks they're facing around climate change and how to build resilience, how to better adapt to those. And historically, the truth is adaptation, as we've already heard some of the speakers talk about, has played second fiddle to decarbonisation. But the good news is we are now seeing adaptation move up the corporate agenda. And that's being driven by a number of things. Firstly, it's featuring much more strongly in the political discourse. So, featured much more at the recent UN climate COP in Dubai last year. And it's being reflected it's beginning to be reflected in emerging regulations. So the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, CSRD in Europe, for example, is meaning that it's on corporate agendas much more. Also, the reality is, of course, we're feeling the impacts of climate change more and more today. So it's a reality for many businesses to deal with. So, I mean, what's changing within organizations that we work with? Firstly, I think there's a recognition of the need to build a business case around adaptation. So being able to quantify the return on investment of implementing particular resilience measures to really get traction internally is becoming much more of a theme. And I think the other thing that's changing is recognition that the impact of climate change can hit a business in so many different ways. And often in areas that aren't in the direct control of the organization concerned. We've talked about could be impacts somewhere deep in the value chain, or it could be impacts to the communities that the employees of an organization work with. And those are the ones often that could hit the business hardest. And sometimes things that you might not immediately think of. So, for example, will you have access to fire, water in a drought? For example, that aren't immediate revenue drivers, but are obviously crucial for business continuity. I think we're also seeing a bit of a shifting of the narrative away from just a pure focus on transition and more of a focus towards building a resilient transition. So adaptation being a crucial part of decarbonisation and transition, which I think is helpful. Just one point to finish on, however, I think we've still got some way to go. Many of the sustainability leaders that we speak to absolutely recognise the need for adaptation, but the reality is that their bandwidth is just consumed by decarbonisation often, and so there just isn't the focus on adaptation that there needs to be, which is why this initiative is so important.
I'd like to come back to that with the group and after our questions. I think you raise a really interesting point of how can companies do both in a streamlined and efficient way. But with that, I'd like to turn to Jess and ask the same question. For AT&T, what is driving AT&T to take action on climate resilience and adaptation? And can you talk a little bit more about how you're seeing any drivers shifting or changing?
Yeah, well, good morning, everyone. So I want to answer this question actually from two vantage points. One, in my current role on the environmental sustainability team, but also from my first role when I joined the company, which was on our network operations team. And in that role, I really got an opportunity to see how critical our service is that we provide to customers. We enable small business customers to run credit cards and parents to work from home and kids to do their homework. And so, everything that we're doing at AT&T is in service of keeping people connected. And we know that hazards like flooding and wildfires can pose a threat to our network and the connectivity that we provide to our customers. So to directly answer your question, business continuity, as Nick said, is a significant driver of AT&T's proactive approach to business resilience. Now, what that looks like for us is using the best available climate data to help protect and prepare our network for whatever hazards may come, and to simultaneously enhance the ability for local communities to adapt as well. So, the way we talk about it is with better data, you make better decisions. And so to be more specific about what that looks like, what we've been able to do and the transformation that's occurred in our processes internally is to incorporate a climate resilience mindset. So we've incorporated this high quality, forward-looking data into our systems and processes for planning and engineering our network. So in other words, when we're making decisions about where to put critical equipment, we're looking at, well, what do we know about what hazards and how they're changing in this particular location. Similarly, we're also using the climate data to identify where do we harden now, where do we put floodgates and generators and things that can help us to avoid those risks and enable our business to continue in challenging conditions. But it doesn't stop there, because we strongly believe that we're more resilient when the communities that we serve are resilient as well. So to help businesses and communities become more resilient, we worked with Argonne National Laboratory as well as FEMA to create the Climate Risk and Resilience Portal. And this portal offers, its short name is Climber. What this portal offers is the same high quality climate data that we've been using to communities, and it's granular data that empowers anyone charged with building resilience in communities to better understand and act on climate-related hazards. And I encourage everyone listening today to go check it out. Knowing what you're up against and how hazards are changing over time, what modifications need to be made today, that is how we build resilient communities to face future threats. So that's the that's the solution we wanted to chat about today, and the drivers and the solutions that we're bringing to bear.
Jess, I've got one follow-up question before I turn back to Peter on a different question. But when you've rolled out Climber, and for full disclosure, C2ES is engaging with AT&T on another pilot that we're working on in Colorado, where we showcased the tool. I think it's a really neat example of public-private partnerships and how the private sector, a tool that can benefit a company, can also be unveiled into the community. Can you just spend a minute or two talking about an experience that AT&T has had with engaging communities on this tool?
Absolutely. So we have made a real effort to do some hand-holding, and we realize that those charged with building resilience in communities, for example, emergency managers, are also simultaneously dealing with COVID. They're dealing with wildfires. They're dealing with all sorts of public crises. So we not only just put out this data on a website, but we then wanted to work in communities like Colorado, which we're working together with the North Front Range community with C2ES, but also with the state of Idaho, where we work with them to integrate insights from the Climber portal into Idaho's hazard mitigation plan. FEMA last year made it mandatory for states to incorporate forward-looking hazards into their hazard mitigation planning, not just historical data or near-term data on where have floods just occurred, right? We need to get ahead and be building back better when a disaster hits, right? So, so what we did for the state of Idaho was scanned. The state looked at avalanche risk, looked at risks around heat, looked at risks around wildfires, and with all that, we were able to add to the state's hazard mitigation plan, which is now published, these forward-looking insights to see then how the state should prioritize funding and grant applications to be able to seek solutions for these emerging risks. So you talked about, public-private partnerships. We then in turn have learned, AT&T has learned from working with these communities and seeing what they do with the data. So it's a really reciprocal relationship, and that's why we want to continue pressing forward and working in a really hands-on way with communities, because we both benefit from that collaboration.
Thank you, Jess. And Nick, I am curious, before I turn to Peter, has Marsh had any different conversations with customers or seeking insurance as a result of the changing climate?
Yes, so I think some of the areas that Jess touched on are absolutely relevant. So, for example, building back better is a core theme for insurance. After a client has suffered a loss following an event, let's make sure we rebuild in a way that is more resilient to better protect them. Similarly, insurers are beginning to offer some resilience type credits, so that to recognize the efforts that clients are investing in building resilience and translating that into an insurance benefit. But I think it's worth saying that these are still relatively few and far between, and I think the insurance industry can certainly go further in recognizing the efforts that individual corporates are making in order to drive the change.
Good to know. All right, I'm going to turn back to Peter now. Thank you, Jess and Nick. I'll come back to you. So, Peter, I want to talk about some of the barriers that we've heard that might impede private sector action. We've heard a little bit so far, but in the report that we all developed, I mean, we look at things like lack of understanding within a company, lack of real support at the C-suite level. I think Emily may have mentioned, or maybe it was Jess that did, how do we measure the impacts, and just generally, how do we improve knowledge and accountability on resilience and adaptation, given that it is a journey and not necessarily an end state. So I'm curious if you can comment on how any of the barriers that exist are impacting, residents' ability to make or assess progress in this space.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. So some of the barriers, and it's touched on in the report, that we're definitely seeing, and it is changing, I think, in the last year or two, but for a lot of companies, it's the time horizon. Looking at sort of short term versus long term is a barrier for sure. The narrative, we've heard consistently, how you define it, how it's communicated, that relates to a barrier within a lot of companies. It's still somewhat siloed. You may have a risk manager, you may have someone that works with operations, supply chain, getting them to communicate well, because it's a problem that has to be addressed across multiple departments or programs within a company. So the narrative helps with that. I'd call something, the four walls mindset for a lot of companies are still looking at, protecting, their own operations first. And that's still a challenge, I think, to get companies to, look at the greater good, look at their wider impact, their value chain. I don't think it's a barrier to know what the climate shocks are at this point. I think you can go most anywhere now and find out what the extreme heat, rainfall is going to be, but it's connecting that data to what companies do with the right people that can make the right decisions. The other thing we consistently still see is it's viewed as a business cost, not an investment. I think the companies that are leading in this area and that we work with, some of them are starting to see it as an investment for how they're going to actually create new markets and create business value. A couple other ones, just the reactive versus proactive. Still see companies kind of reacting to issues, not proactively working on them. And it's been touched on here. I think still within a lot of corporates, there's a huge focus on net zero and energy transition, which is more of a technology problem or solution, really. It's not really focused as much on people. So I think that's where it's harder with adaptation and resilience within the corporate world to shift the mindset around. You're actually protecting people. You're protecting your operations, but you're protecting people along your value chain. And as some of these companies, and I'm talking about like CPG, food companies, water companies, technology companies, a lot of this work is locally led. So a challenge, a barrier still is, and this is where, to answer your question, Marina, is a lot of our work is working with partners at the local level to do the work, is delivering adaptation and resilience solutions. We're doing work in Africa and Asia and Latin America at the local level, because they know what the issue is, they can deliver the work. That's still a barrier, is for large corporates to connect into that. And that's probably one of the areas where we at Resonance are finding, a good area, along with some of these reports and frameworks, is developing partnerships, increasingly partnerships with the philanthropy sector, with donor agencies like USAID or World Bank, and the private sector around a common challenge. Like circular economy, real quick, is one we're doing a lot of work in. It's still adaptation and resilience. That work is creating, and I think someone mentioned the overlap between energy transition and adaptation. A lot of these projects are creating energy efficiency, reducing, driving decarbonization, and creating adaptation together. And we're seeing the partnerships as a way to de-risk projects, look at a longer time horizon, and get more done in the corporate world too.
And I think, Peter, to your point, I think you're talking about partnerships and governments. For those of you that may have seen the news from COP28, USAID launched their private sector call to action through their Prepare program, in terms of how the private sector can help galvanize and increase resilience and adaptation around the world. So that's another body of work. We have other bodies of work that are out there that we've been looking at, and so stay tuned to some of our other organizations with whom we work. We'll be making some announcements in the coming weeks. So what I want to do now is turn to, again, Jess and Nick, and then Emily. But I want to turn to that today we're unveiling 5 working principles for corporate climate resilience leadership. These principles set a bar for leadership with companies, stating that companies that are leading on climate resilience, or taking action on it in a leading way, are science-based and proactive. Are the principles that they are taking steps that are transparent and accountable. They are working to safeguard and enhance communities and ecosystems, and they are inclusive, equitable, and transformative. And for those that are listening, these were working principles that were developed with input from about 70 different stakeholders over the last 6 months or so. And as we move forward in this space, they may evolve, but these are really meant to kind of anchor and galvanize corporate action. I'm curious, and Jess, I think I'll start with you. From your perspective, what is the value of setting this common view of leadership, and what does this look like if a company wanted to implement these principles into practice?
Absolutely. So first, I want to say how excited we are about the debut of these principles. And at AT&T, we are so excited about this push to align the private sector around what effective resilience building looks like. Because resilience is not something that can be achieved in a vacuum. We have to, for instance, at AT&T, we have to take measures to safeguard our network, but we are only as resilient as the electric grid is, and we need utilities to then in turn take steps to ensure that they're prepared, because it's this reciprocal relationship. We are hopeful that the principles for corporate climate resilience will encourage more businesses to take effective action on this issue. To give you a sense of what we've found in our own company that aligns with these principles, so I want to take the first one around being science-based and proactive in one's approach. So when AT&T actually started on our journey to build climate resilience, we actually couldn't find the kind of forward-looking data that we needed, that was actionable and granular enough for us to be able to make decisions about the components of our network. So instead of giving up, we work with Argonne National Laboratory to create the data that we required, using one of the world's largest supercomputers to model how hazards such as flooding, wind speeds, wildfire risk, could change at the neighborhood level over the next 30 years. So again, that just underscores the importance of being science-based. The other piece of this is the fourth principle on being equitable and inclusive. We often say at AT&T, resilience is an area where you collaborate, you don't compete. And so, we knew from the start that we needed to share the data that we had with everyone so that we can help, whether you are a community, whether you are a business, everyone needs to adapt to climate change. So when a community where we have a footprint uses our data to, for example, identify where flooding may pose an issue, or wildfire, them taking steps to manage that risk, that's not only good for the community, especially vulnerable populations in that community, but it's also good for our equipment that resides in that community. So really it serves both ends. So we know from our experience that these are the right principles to focus on, and we just encourage more companies to adopt them to advance their resilience efforts.
And I'll pose the same question for Nick, but I'm curious, before I do, Jess, from your perspective, if you're a company, and maybe in a similar sector to where AT&T is, but you can imagine other sectors like consumer packaged goods, or maybe apparel, or maybe tech, or maybe manufacturing, how might a company, if they said, look, we like these principles and we'd like to move towards beginning to implement them, what would be maybe one first step that a company that's new to this but wants to take action could think about doing?
Yeah, I think one of the most important things, and something we did, was to understand how climate change is affecting your company today, right? It's less persuasive to say, here's what you could see in 30 years if you're not capturing the real costs of disasters on your company present day. And when we totaled that, it's hundreds of millions of dollars that we saw that, whether it was Hurricane Harvey or whether it was wildfires in Colorado, we saw how our poles and how our critical equipment was being affected, and the cost that drove for the company. So that, having not just a fuzzy sense, but a very concrete sense of what those costs look like and the expenses, start to make that case for, well, should we really have a break fix situation, or should we think ahead and look at, where should we put an aluminum gate on a critical piece of infrastructure so that it won't flood in the future? So that's what I would advise first, of understanding the real cost to your company today.
Okay, great. Well, Nick, I'll turn the question to you about the principles that I initially asked Jess. When we think about these principles setting a bar for leadership, from your perspective from Marsh, what is the value of setting this common view of leadership, and what would this look like in practice for an insurance broker and the companies with whom you work?
So I guess it's worth saying, first and foremost, I think the value of having these principles is it provides a framework around which to coalesce, and I think that's a crucial step that this initiative has taken. But I think the real power of these principles is their interpretation at the corporate level. I mean, principles by their very nature are relatively high level, and as we've already talked about, adaptation really it impacts you at a very local level in many different ways, and I think Jess illustrated that very well in the context of AT&T. So when we work with clients, it's really around thinking about all the different components of adaptation. We talk to clients about businesses about thinking about adaptation at two levels, both at the asset level, so what's going to impact the specific local asset you're thinking about, the building or the asset itself, the people and operations at that location, the emergency response, steps that you need to take, and then the broader system level. So the suppliers, the communities you work in, the investors, the governments, and local entities that you interact with. And I think it's really thinking about each of those and how do the principles apply to each of those components that you really sort of derive power from it. And then maybe I'll just answer the question you asked, Jess, in terms of one thing for our clients to think about. I think is the value chain. It's the area that is often not as visible as many corporates would like it to be to them, and it's often where they derive the biggest business interruption through climate events. And I think a real focus there can deliver huge benefit.
Excellent, really good point. I'm going to turn to Emily now before we begin to open up the floor for Q&A. So for those that are still looking at questions, please send them in the chat. We have a number of really good ones that we're going to ask. But Emily, as you've seen this conversation around climate resilience evolve, and you've been in space also a long time in different capacities, and you've seen the role of corporates in the space also evolving in the future over the next 5 years. If you had one wish that would make your work in the space easier, what would it be?
Well, if I could have 4 wishes, it'd be amazing. But first, I wanted to just step back to kind of conversations that we're having today within Meta. Actually, last week we had a cross-company workshop that we brought together leaders and experts from across the company to truly understand what adaptation and climate resilience means to us at Meta. We've been conducting engineering studies and climate risk assessments, like Jess mentioned, for several years now. And so we have a really good understanding of what our core exposure and vulnerability is to climate change. We discussed historic incidents that have happened, how we've taken action, how we could have taken different actions. And it's just amazing to see how much there's actually being done within the company that isn't necessarily being talked about or communicated. So that gave me a lot of hope now. And so, thinking about 5 years from now, that's going to be 2029. That's, March of 2029, we'll have 8 months left to have achieved our net zero target, because Meta has set a 2030 target for net zero. So my 4 wishes are really aligned with what is outlined in our report. The first being visionary corporate leadership at the C-suite, and true champions that understand and fully embrace the business case for investing in climate resilience. This has been talked about throughout all of our speakers today, to really create that long-term success. It's understanding that investing in climate resilience is investing in your business success. Our mission at Meta is to give people the power to build community and build the world closer, bring the world closer together. We can't do that if we're not addressing climate change, both on the mitigation front for reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, but also adapting to to the various different shocks and stresses that we face related to climate change. But also, we know that climate change is a threat multiplier. So we have to think about climate change in the context of other stresses. We can't think about ourselves in a silo. We have to think about our neighboring communities. We have to think about the critical resources and infrastructure that we depend on, like power and water and transportation and communication and IT. So it's, having that visioning and that understanding at the corporate level, at the C-suite level, and embracing that instead of thinking about it in terms of a competing goal would be one of my first wishes. The second being, effective governance, and governance from the top down as well as the bottom up. Without this, there's really not a lot of accountability. There's not as much investment as we need. And it's going to be a harder, longer challenge than we're already facing. So, and it also can't just be a handful of sectors really leading the charge. All of us have to take part. And so one of the best parts about being in the private sector space is that we can collaborate and we can partner with each other, but we need to go further than that. We need to really partner with the communities on the ground, like Peter mentioned, in those local areas that really need enhanced resilience. So we need to understand what their needs are and support them. Instead of saying, this is what we need, it's really having a listening ear and saying, what is it that you need to truly be more resilient as a community? Third, a robust framework, guidance standards, and measurable indicators. We can't measure, we can't manage what we can't measure, right? And my work through the Fifth National Climate Assessment really highlighted the fact that there aren't very many indicators that are out there right now that are useful for helping us as corporations or organizations or communities understand how to measure success and what does successful adaptation or climate resilience look like. So I'm really excited about this initiative because moving forward, that's our plan, is to develop this framework, some guidance, some ideas on different indicators that we can leverage and tailor to our own industries. And then lastly, just radical collaboration between public and private sector. I think there are a lot of barriers right now that really limit us from partnering with local organizations or local governments. And we have to find better ways to form public-private partnerships so we can get past those barriers and take action and learn from lessons, learn from our failures, and share those lessons with others across the world, because that's how we get to scale up solutions. We get that transformative change that we really need, and we see that long-term tackling of climate change.
Great. Well, thank you, Emily. I'm going to open up with some questions that we've been getting from our audience, and I'll kind of do them in 3 buckets. And I think we have time for those 3. If we have time for more, we will. But the first one will be around how companies can think about decarbonization and resilience together. The second one is going to be really focused on reporting. We see a lot of with the SEC rule that was finalized a few weeks ago here in the United States, as well as regulations like the CSRD in Europe. What that means for measuring and reporting on resilience. And then I do want to end on a high note, which is on collaboration opportunities between sectors and governments. So let's try and tackle those 3 buckets, and we'll see where we are on time. So the first one will be on, I'm curious to get back to how could companies, as they're approaching their decarbonization goals and as they're approaching resilience, how can they work internally so that those 2 efforts are aligned and efficient? And I'll open the floor to see if somebody wants to answer. Otherwise, I'll call on someone.
Yeah, actually, I'm happy to start, Ray, because I was thinking about that question as you were mentioning it. So I mentioned when I was speaking before, decarbonization typically is technology based. I mean, you're looking at energy reduction, carbon capture, renewables, but some of the overlaps we've seen, one is last mile energy. So a lot of these, especially in developing countries, some of the work Rockefeller's doing, for example, to electrify Africa, at its core, it's a net zero project. But a big part of it is connecting that energy to villages and people that need it. So it's resilience, it's the 2 together. So it's this connection of energy and sort of last mile or energy access. Another big one that we're seeing, especially in the SHARM work and work we do, is food and agriculture. So as you help that sector become more resilient, grow food in extreme heat, address climate, flooding and, climate adaptation work in that sector, you're also preserving those areas for carbon sinks. For what is it? A third of the solution is from the food and ag sector for decarbonization. Water's another one. As you do water work, you're also creating opportunities to reduce energy and resilience together. And even some of the work we're doing around fisheries for our company. I mean, you're creating adaptation, but some of the infrastructure around that, if you do it correctly, is having a big impact on decarbonization as well.
Wonderful, thank you. Nick, do you have any views on that?
Yes, I guess that there are a few sort of specific examples, just picking up on Peter's points. Certainly the large infrastructure that's going to be required for the energy transition, so renewable infrastructure, carbon sequestration infrastructure, making sure that when those initiatives are put in place, that resilience and adaptation is thought about at the same time, so that you're building these things so that they're resilient to climate change, is clearly clearly key. And then I think there are other areas that are maybe where there are trade-offs to be made, which are potentially tricky. So, for example, in South Africa, where they're thinking about implementing rolling blackouts to conserve energy, sometimes through necessity. In order to provide backup power, you may need diesel generators. That's clearly that clearly goes against the sort of a decarbonisation agenda. So being conscious of those trade-offs and making sure that they really are a last resort when you're implementing these things are the kinds of decisions you have to make. So I guess the main point is when you're thinking about decarbonisation, applying a resilience or adaptation lens to that as part of the decision making is the key thing.
Thank you.
Yeah,
I was going to turn to Emily and Jess for sure. Who wants to jump in?
I was just going to build on the exact example that Nick just mentioned. So we're dealing with that in terms of backup power generators, our net zero goal, right? So we have backup power generators that are diesel powered. We're phasing those out because we want to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, but we need backup power for our data centers. And so we're actually investing in various different renewable energy alternatives for our power generators, like HVO. And that's a way that we're looking at both climate adaptation and resilience with the transition to net zero, as well as the fact that whenever we make any investments in new infrastructure, we're looking at water and energy and climate and all sorts of different factors in the future. So we're looking at different projections. We're taking those into consideration collectively instead of just making a decision based on where we need to locate different data centers or offices. So we're really thinking about it as in an integrated manner, both with our existing sites and our future investments.
Thank you. Jess, what are your thoughts on that?
We also face this dilemma, so that really resonated as well. So AT&T has a commitment to become carbon neutral by 2035, and the running joke between me and my colleague who manages that initiative is like, you're working against my stuff because you want to put it in these generators, and I've got this goal now. It takes a lot of electricity to power AT&T's network. But the new chapter where I'm able to help my colleague has been around taking the temperature projections, for example, that we have where we're able to show the average summer high for the city of Dallas in 2050 is going to look like about 122. So, looking at that startling number and thinking about how much electricity it's going to take to run our HVACs, right, to be able to stabilize our equipment and keep our network running optimally, we can leverage that data to help him build the business case for more efficient HVAC upgrades or maintenancing and things that maybe haven't been at the top of the list, but now we can say, hey, given these stressors that we're going to see in the future, here's why you want to take these steps to increase our own efficiency, in addition to buying renewables and all the other things that we do. But I think this is where we've been able to partner by using some of this critical climate data that we've used for our resilience efforts.
That's really helpful. I'm wondering, maybe I'll turn to Jess and Emily one more time, and then I'll ping Nick and Peter afterwards. But what advice would you give for companies that are wanting to internally align so much of the success of these efforts to be able to make good on a company's goals, as well as to build resilience, lies in how a company works internally? What might be some emerging or best practices or advice that you might give to companies who are trying to do both? And maybe, Emily, I'll start with you and then Jess.
Sure. I mean, I think just starting to socialize the fact that these elements of addressing climate change are both necessary, and they can work together, and there are different examples of how they can work in harmony. There are also ways that they can't work in harmony, and so making sure that folks are aware of that. If you're investing in renewable energy in a location that is vulnerable to climate impacts, maybe think about how you're preparing for those climate impacts and not just investing in that sustainable infrastructure. And so I think, just bringing in examples to highlight what it means to work together when it comes to sustainability and climate resilience is really helpful. Actually, I sit within the net zero team, and so I partner with them every day. And it's an amazing collaboration because they understand the importance of climate resilience because of the fact that, they're working on climate change every day. But we're also working across the company. So I think it's also developing champions internally of folks that don't think about climate change every day and think about how climate might impact them or how what they're doing can enhance the resilience both to the company, but also to, the issues we relate to climate change and the impacts we're going to face and continue to face. So it's really now that there are some regulations out there also, it's a active driver for us to have those conversations, to integrate climate risk into our integrated risk management process, into different areas that we're investing in. So not only is it an important topic that can look at both sides and both components of climate mitigation and adaptation, but it's also a way that we can align with different regulations that are coming out and really be successful in this new world.
Jess, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, we a lot of the same themes of, one, company-wide education on why this is important, right? And we at AT&T have a lot of channels for that. So we have an environmental champions group. So we use that group to share our initiatives, but then empower them to take those and integrate them into the work that they do every day, whether they're in a call center or whether they're out on a network field team, to be able to bring these to life and integrate them into our business operations. Another piece I'll say is empathy, and I do think it can be hard when you're in the environmental sustainability space to remember that our colleagues in other business units are under cost pressures. They're, rolling out really complex initiatives, and you have to be able to make the case of how you are helping them do what they do even better. So, a lot of our success in integrating our climate data into business operations is thinking about, okay, there's an initiative today around backup power. How do we get, involved in that and just say, hey, we're going to help you be even more precise about where you put those generators, or, for flooding preparation, how do we tell you where you don't have to put floodgates, for example. We can save you money by telling you it is equally as important where you don't need to safeguard, company buildings versus where you do, right? So I think being able to tuck your goal under other larger, already in motion initiatives helps in a large company get you over the finish line. And I think, you mentioned this, Emily, but, celebrating our business partners, doing hero making, putting them on, social media to talk about why they are personally passionate about this and why this makes a difference in their job. So there's a lot of different ways that you can get this incorporated, but it does take a lot of listening, a lot of planning, and a lot of education on why it's important.
Thank you. So we've got time for 3 more quick questions. I'm going to bring Raquel back for a moment at the end before we turn over to Seth. One question I will ask of Peter, and that is, so when we think about the climate resilience space, a lot we hear about is dominated by risk assessment, and these are questions that are coming in from audience members. And this audience member asks, to what extent is that, in this case, residents considering adaptive capacity in its work, and measuring it as a component to vulnerability to climate impacts?
Yeah, that's a great question. So one of the things we're doing, and a lot of firms, I imagine larger corporates and even smaller advisory firms, are starting to set up either individuals or groups that can look at look at measurement. We actually have what's called evidence for transformation, but it's a group that specifically looks at data and information, especially around climate, on how well organizations or operations or supply chains can adapt to future climate shocks. So it's in a way, it's almost like looking at scenario planning, and that hasn't been mentioned today, but a lot of corporates where I've worked with and I think are looking at scenario planning too. Like, what's the world going to look like for their company in a climate challenged world in 2030, 2040? And in a way, that's driving a little bit, or dropping a lot, I think, adaptive capacity. So where do we need to build up either new skills, new partners, shift the business? Nestle is a great example, right? They're looking at extreme heat. I would call this adaptive capacity on their supply chain by 2040. A lot of companies aren't going to be able to grow what they're growing now due to projected heat in 10 or 15 years. So they're starting to look at what's their capacity for adaptation to shift what they grow, protect workers, enter new markets. And so it's more of a proactive stance. And some companies are starting to proactively look at that to become a market leader. And they need to measure it. That's the other part. It's hard. But so yeah, we're seeing more companies take that stance and start to look at how they need to grow their capacity around this whole area.
Thank you.
Just maybe, Verena, if I could add a quick point to Peter's comments. I think one of the concepts that is quite helpful here is thinking about the adaptation window. So a lot of the risks that are arising due to climate change may not be impacting the company today. They may be, some of them may be impacting certain assets in 2030, some 2040, some even beyond. So it's not necessarily a case of you have to find all this investment today. You can actually, based on when the risk is going to be there, plan your adaptation roadmap in accordance with that. So I think that's a kind of good news story that is quite helpful for businesses to understand.
And Nick, I think just building on that, the question I wanted to follow up and ask you is, how do you see companies beginning to respond to the changing reporting regulations, both in the US and the EU, where around the physical impacts of climate change?
So, I mean, as we talked about, the reporting requirements and disclosure requirements on companies is helping bring those concepts up the corporate agenda. So there are, and if we think about sort of scope 1, 2, and 3 disclosures, that's why a lot of focus is spent on sort of by sustainability teams on these kinds of aspects. And I think as adaptation is more included in the regulation, we're going to see more focus and more capacity being systematically built out within organizations to focus on this. So I think we're beginning to see that. I mentioned the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive in Europe. It impacts, in fact, any corporate with operations in Europe. So it's quite wide-reaching, and we're beginning to see some of that sort of growing business need to have that expertise. Similarly, I think we're going to begin to see that more in the US. Notably, sort of scope 3 emissions were not part of the recent SEC regulations. That might actually free up some capacity that was spent on sort of carbon disclosures to think about adaptation. So I think it may help. It may help the adaptation agenda. And I think we're going to see a sort of similar story else in other jurisdictions as well.
Very helpful. I'd like to actually invite Raquel to join the panelists here. I'm going to ask one question of everyone, and it has to do with collaborations and partnerships. I'm curious if everyone can think of, and as wide and big as you can, what would it look like to create more collaborations within sectors and industries, or within sectors and governments, or even within a sector itself? So we only have about a minute for each person to answer, but if you can think about what would be a really valuable way to create more collaborations. If anybody wants to go first. Raquel, we'll end with you, but maybe I'll ask one of the 4 company panelists to go first.
I can jump in, Verena. I think honestly, when we're developing plans and actions around climate resilience and adaptation, inviting the communities that are in the jurisdictions where we're operating and living in to do that shared planning would be one effort that I think would be really helpful, so that we're not planning for different futures, we're not planning for different hazards at different levels, because there's so many government entities that are already, they already have climate adaptation plans, or they're updating their plans. And companies are yet to do that. And so can we have, different workshops or exercises within communities where we do that shared planning, and then we have that accountability for action, and we revisit, the plan, and we look at how we're implementing it. Is it working? Is it not? How do we need to adjust? How do we need to adapt? So I think, that joint planning now will help us in the long run to really be better stewards, better partners, and to share some of the information that we're gathering in terms of climate risk assessments and whatnot. So that's one area that I think would be really helpful for more progress to be made.
Thank you, Emily. And just because we are running on time, if I can maybe call on Jess, Nick, Peter, and then we'll end with Raquel for what kinds of collaborations, how can we foster better collaborations?
Yeah, so as I discussed earlier, AT&T, Argonne, and FEMA have all worked together and brought their unique expertise to the table for our climate risk and resilience portal. And I think, what I've learned from that is, the power of the unique talents of each of these different organizations coming together has delivered a better product ultimately in the portal. And we've been able to get feedback from communities on things like, can you help us actually better understand heat waves and what they're going to look like in the future? And so we've only further enhanced the portal through all of that input that each unique player has provided. And I think that fostering more collaborations like that can only enhance the work.
Thank you, Jess. Nick, what are your thoughts?
Well, it's hard to top so Emily and Jess's they're fantastic. Maybe just to pick on a slightly different aspect, I mentioned the importance of the supply chain and that being a sort of critical area of vulnerability and therefore the need for adaptation. So I think more sort of collaboration across supply chains to really understand that better would be a great help.
Peter, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, a little different tack. So with I think almost 2 trillion needed that could yield 7 trillion in net benefits, partnerships for the financial sector. So one thought I've had is if you could get a shared purpose for what we're doing, and you could get everyone from philanthropy to de-risk investments, insurance, private equity, banking, corporates, and then carbon markets all coming in to unlock capital for adaptation, playing at the right areas where they can reduce risk, bring in banks, make it viable for the corporates, all come under sort of one shared purpose goal. We could unlock in the financial sector through a partnership, all the capital that's needed to make these changes.
Wow, thanks. And Raquel, welcome back. Thank you for joining us. I'm very keen to hear your perspective on where you see partnerships as really critical.
We're seeing so many amazing results from partnerships, and in 3 primary areas, but across the board. Certainly in financial services, as you've indicated, we have a financial advisory committee made up of players that would normally be competing against each other, who are collaborating towards getting climate projects over the line. But we're seeing it in a lot of circular economy projects. There's a project in Bahamas where they're building carbon negative housing using waste from one industry and using that to construct housing that absorbs carbon. We're seeing it in Grenada as well, where waste from one industry is creating fertilizer for another. We're seeing it in Barbados, where they're creating the sargassum beach waste and turning that into fuel to help the government in their zero carbon transition in transportation. So we're seeing it. We're also seeing it in data. We're working across a variety of data providers as well as philanthropists on bringing data to the region. We are a bit of a data desert, so certainly any data that's available, we'd love to put it on our Climate Smart map. But I think the biggest thing on collaboration is the campaign from Global Optimism last year and the action that they were able to get coming out of COP28. And that's what we need to do, is to create these movements that it's not industry, it's not siloed. It is all of us saying that we care about this equally and we are willing to move together despite our differences to get everything over the line.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to we're moved to the final section here of our webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. And I'd like to invite Seth Schultz to come to the screen. And Seth is the CEO of Chief Executive of Resilience First Partner Resilience Rising. Seth has a long track record of collaboration in this space. He has led a lot of work with things like U.S. Green Building Council, Clinton Foundation, C40, Global Covenant of Mayors, and he will tell you all about the work Resilience Rising is doing, as we are very, very lucky to have Resilience Rising and Resilience First as our partner in our work.
Thanks, Verena. Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah? What a fun way to come into this into this discussion after that panel, and on a topic ending near and dear to my heart, which is radical collaboration. And thanks again to everybody who we just heard from the top to bottom of this agenda, and great appreciation to those for jumping in so seamlessly when I was unceremoniously booted out earlier, but I'm back. And as Verena said, I'm the CEO of Resilience Rising and a managing director and board member of Resilience First. And just as a quick introduction to both of those organizations, Resilience Rising is a global organization and working to do nothing less than mainstream resilience into everyone's daily lives. And we do that through radical collaboration across key stakeholders and communities of practice. Our Resilience First, one of the most important to us, is one of the world's largest network, over 550 companies around the world focusing on resilience. And it is through that and our deep collaboration with C2ES that we're here today talking about this topic. So some practice into words there. I thought I would just do a little bit of an overview of some of the things that you've just heard about and kind of a synthesis for those not familiar. I also wanted to recognize, and I think Verena had mentioned this, that to date on this initiative, we've got over 70 different sustainability and climate experts from a very broad range of industries, public and private forums engaging on this, many of whom I've seen on the call today, but there's also some of you who are new to this. But that's it's also exciting because we're early stages of this, right? So we launched the Corporate Climate Resilience Pathways Initiative in September of 2023, so less than a year ago during the New York City Climate Week. And through this convening and this process that you've heard about already, and in some great depth from a couple of our key drivers and stakeholders here. But I wanted to kind of share some of the outputs and strategic direction for the next phase of this work. And in particular, some of the issues that we've been exploring to date in these conversations and what's driving business action. And I am really excited about this. You know, there's lots of those that think that the private sector is not good at collaborating. They're focused on competing. But I thought was really insightful from a number of the panel members we just heard from is that collaboration is systemic, and it absolutely requires deep and radical collaboration if we're going to achieve that. And resilience isn't a flat outcome. It's a process. It's a process and it's a journey. And the more people we take on it with us, the better we will be in terms of achieving those outcomes. And that's exactly what's been happening with this initiative, which is so exciting for me personally. But as we've been talking to everybody over the last 9 months and building this first initial phase of the program, some of the kind of very real challenges and the barriers that businesses face, like competing C-suite priorities, a nascent kind of ever-evolving regulatory environment, and perceptions, both, I think it's important to acknowledge, both real and or otherwise, of the investability of resilience and the lack of standardization and a unified framework and globally agreed upon processes to measure and demonstrate these impacts has really stymied corporate leadership on the topic of climate resilience. But I think that kind of the message from these consultations has been kind of clear and unequivocal, which is we need a foundational and shared vision for corporate leadership. And that's exactly what the working principles are that we're launching today, that we're so excited to be sharing with everybody. I won't kind of go through those in details. We just flashed those up on the slide again, what those principles are and what we've been working towards. But I think more importantly, those principles establish a shared and foundational vision for corporate leadership. And they're working principles for a reason, right? I mean, we understand that what these look like in practice is going to vary from industry to industry and from one company to another and from one specific place. I think we heard a lot from the panelists and the speakers just before us about the importance of rooting these solutions in the context and the location that they are in. So how do we bridge these global to regional to very hyper-local issues? And of course, as you read these in more detail in the report that we're launching today, we'd love for you to consider how these principles might help in your own planning and prioritizing and hearing back from you. So just quickly, this is just the first step, no less critical in that it's the first step towards a long journey on this transformational kind of global economic system journey that we're all on. I think Peter touched about that, as did a few others. But just to highlight, going back to some of the things that Nat shared with us at the top of this session, is that we are at a critical juncture. And we feel strongly, as do I know many of you, that companies have a huge opportunity to demonstrate the leadership and spearhead the transformation that is going to allow us to not just survive a world impacted by climate change, but to thrive in spite of it. But we know that there are some key conditions that must be established to bring this vision to life. We need, first and foremost, visionary leadership. And I think you've seen evidenced a lot of that on the call today. We need a robust and universally recognized framework for meaningful action, which is exactly what we're embarking on. That's kind of set forth and created by businesses for businesses that can then expand beyond that and include other communities. We need practical implementation guidance. How are we actually going to do this, and how can we learn from each other in doing it? And not last, or least important rather, but we need an insightful tracking to measure and manage the impact and to help foster healthy competition. And of course, no session like this could go by without, again, me underscoring what you've heard from everybody else, is that radical collaboration and knowledge sharing across all these sectors and at all levels is absolutely essential. So just in closing, I'm very grateful for the support and endorsement we all are from ATT, Marsh, Meta, and Resonance. You just heard from some of them, and you can see why they've been championing this effort from the start. Also incredibly grateful for the support and endorsement of the High Level Climate Champions team, the Race to Resilience team, we've had a very close organizational relationship since the launch of that initial campaign in 2021. And we're very hopeful that through the launch of this paper today and these principles, that we're extending an invitation to industry peers, stakeholders, leaders to collaborate and join us on this journey. So thank you so much for sharing your time with us today. We greatly appreciate it. I'm going to hand it back to Shazray to close us out.
Thank you, Seth. And thank you, Verena, and all of our speakers for that insightful conversation. Lots of food for thought there, and we look forward to continuing that discussion at future forums. I know we had loads more questions than we actually had time for, but we'll have many opportunities to keep the conversation going. I'm conscious of time, but I did want to take just a quick minute to talk through some next steps and a couple of points that we wanted to share with you. So with today's report and the leadership principles, what we're really aiming to do is to underscore the very critical need for robust and urgent private sector action. And through the principles, we want to offer a vision of the effort that will accelerate action and provide a guiding compass for companies to support their own efforts. Over the last few months, we've been so heartened to see a real uptick in the resources developed for businesses, including some fantastic recent publications from the Race to Resilience campaign in partnership with PwC, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, the World Economic Forum, BCG, and others. And as we talk about this ecosystem of resilience transformation that's building, it would really be remiss of me to not mention recent initiatives by the finance and investment community as well, that aim to incentivize private sector resilience efforts and solutions. So from our colleagues over at the Climate Bond Initiative's Resilience Taxonomy that they're looking to develop, to Gary's Investor Toolkit, that's the Global Adaptation and Resilience Investment Group, for those who aren't familiar, which was announced just last week, and I think has had a lot of traction as well already. So we're really proud to be joining these ambitious efforts to catalyze business investment, and we're committed to facilitating the broad collaboration across this space to really speed up progress, because we're all ultimately working for the same shared goals. I hope you've all found today's conversation insightful. And I look forward to your feedback on the report and the principles as you do go through them. You can find them on our websites, and we'll share a link with everyone who joined later today. As you've heard already, this is our first step in a multi-year initiative, and our focus for the next few months will really be to work closely with businesses and key stakeholders so we can continue to validate the principles and also help to start bringing them to life. You can see on the screen some of the ways that we'd love to engage with you over the course of this year. So I'd just like to close by saying a huge thank you to all of our speakers, our sponsors, our 70+ contributors who shared their expertise with us that helped us build this report and the principles over the last 6 months, and to the Climate Champions team for their support and endorsement for this effort. And last but not least, thank you all so much for joining. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation today. Please do get in touch if you'd like to connect with us on any of the topics discussed. We'd love to hear from you. So thank you, and I hope you have a very good rest of the day.